As we enter the era of 4K being standard, we'll be seeing games continue to evolve in impressive ways. AAA titles will boast insanely detailed textures on 3D models that have polygon counts in the millions. Draw distances will be miles far, and environments will be dense with assets. A plethora of visual effects will constantly fill your screen, whether they're beautiful particles or awe-striking ray tracing techniques. And let's not forget, the new super-fast SSDs will severely cut down on loading times, in some cases eliminating them entirely. It should come as no surprise that as games become bigger, flashier, and more complex, the average file size of games will follow suit. It's unavoidable. It's a cycle that continues to repeat. Technology advances, allowing for grander visions to come to fruition, and game developers take advantage of this technology to reach new heights and offer greater experiences. And for the consumer, this means more real estate on their storage drives will be taken over by individual games. For example, Demon's Souls is likely going to be PlayStation 5's biggest first-party launch title alongside Spider-Man Miles Morales. It's already confirmed to be coming in at a pretty hefty 66 gigabytes. In comparison, Dark Souls 3 was less than 20 and Bloodborne less than 30 on day one for each. Obviously, this wasn't always an issue. All the way up until the end of the 7th generation of consoles, which is the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and the Nintendo Wii, physical games were directly playable from whatever physical media they came on, discs or cartridges. With only a handful of exceptions, we didn't need to install them directly onto a hard drive to play them. And if we did, it typically wasn't the entire game being installed. Sometimes it was just recommended for better loading times, but for the vast majority of titles, it wasn't mandatory. This requirement was something that was still limited just to PC games at the time. However, when the next generation started with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, console owners had to get used to the installation process too, because the average game size was going to grow, and reading the game from the disc just isn't as fast as reading it from the hard drive. Thus, storage space became significantly more important almost overnight. And throughout the generation, we saw just how stupidly massive some games can get. At the very beginning, we already got games crossing 40 gigabytes, which wasn't a size that was unreasonably large just yet. However, now, at the end of it, they've finally begun to cross 3 digits. It's not yet a regular occurrence, but it very well could be once the next generation, which is the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, hits its stride. In the lead up to release, Red Dead Redemption 2 was noted for alarming people with its massive 90 gigabyte install size on day one. This was the amount that came on the 2 discs before you added any patches or updates. Several other games come close to or even past this number, mostly due to updates and DLC that came later, such as Gears of War 4 and Destiny 2, both of which crossed the 100 gigabyte mark, but also received updates that addressed the size issue and shrunk them down, either by implementing new compression techniques or eliminating old content. However, the most egregious perpetrator of storage drive gluttony, which is such a space hog that the size of its updates sometimes outweigh other entire AAA games, is Modern Warfare. Depending on which platform you play on, it could approach a frustratingly gargantuan 250 gigabytes in size for the entire package. The game does allow players to uninstall certain parts, either the single-player campaign, multiplayer, or special ops, to free up some space. If you're the type of Call of Duty player who only plays the campaign, you'll just uninstall the whole thing when you're done anyway. However, if you're a multiplayer-focused Call of Duty owner, you're still going to be asked to surrender a massive chunk of your storage because, for some reason, it still takes up around 170 gigabytes of space. And it's not even known how much of this is Warzone-only content, which is mandatory. According to a production director over at Infinity Ward, it's not much, but still. Why? That's the big question everyone asks. Why does one first-person shooter take up more than twice as much space as a massive open-world title with a 60-hour story and insanely detailed map? Why does this shooter's multiplayer, by itself, take up to 4 times as much space as an MMO with 3 full expansions and thousands of hours of content? What is lacking under the hood that forbids the game from being crunched down to a size that doesn't ask players to forfeit up to half of their entire hard drive? For comparison's sake, let's look at the recently released Ghost of Tsushima. It's an open world game with a map that's in the ballpark of about 11 square miles or 17.7 square kilometers. It's not particularly huge, there are much bigger maps out there, but it's sizable enough to have many unique features and landscapes that don't feel crunched into an impossible space. The game is very new, but it's already known to be one of the best looking games to come out this generation. Every single line of dialogue in the game is fully voiced, and the story takes anywhere from 30 to 50 hours to finish. And the game is noted to have shockingly quick load times in spite of all of these details. You might be thinking, but that's a single-player game. It doesn't compare to Call of Duty, which has a heavy focus on multiplayer. And, well, actually, as of the 1.1 update that came out a few weeks ago, it's a multiplayer game now too, thanks to Legends mode, which is a fairly content-rich cooperative mode with redesigned environments, new armor and weapons, cosmetics, many new enemies, and a self-contained narrative. And guess what? Even after Legends came out, Ghost of Tsushima, the entire game, single player and multiplayer, still comes in at only 45 gigabytes. How did Sucker Punch manage such a thing? Well, as it turns out, their black magic was just good compression techniques. In an interview with Kotaku, Sucker Punch's lead engine programmer Adrian Bentley said, "Our art teams did an amazing job pushing their assets to fit in our aggressive performance and memory budgets. As an example, one of our 200 meter by 200 meter terrain tiles only usually takes up around 2 megabytes, compressed on disk, including all the terrain and foliage placements. It's easier to load a lot of data when you keep it compact." A huge reason for games having inflated file sizes is duplicated assets. Games typically put copies of assets all over the game's files so they're easier to locate and thus minimize loading times, at the cost of increasing size. As an example, back at the Game Developers Conference in 2019, Insomniac Games gave a presentation, and in that presentation was this simple slide pertaining to their Spider-Man game, showing that almost 56,000 assets are duplicated one or more times, inflating the game's size by 10 gigabytes, from 0.9 without duplication to 11 with. Doing just a little math, we can determine that each asset was duplicated, on average, up to 11 times. Considering the retail version of the game is 45 gigabytes, that means duplication takes up about 22% of its size. Now let's go back to Ghost of Tsushima. Surely Sucker Punch must have duplicated a ton of stuff if the game's loading times are insanely quick, right? In that same interview with Kotaku, Mr. Bentley continues, "Our mesh and texturing systems are very fine-grained and fairly conservative. We only have one copy of every asset on the disk. During most loads, when not jumping into a close-up, we only load newly required assets and can dial down our streaming density a bit. This usually results in requesting 1 or maybe 2 fewer bitmap levels for big textures. Users shouldn't see pops because we still have the textured data we need to render when jumping into gameplay 99% of the time." Essentially, Ghost of Tsushima is able to keep its total size small and loading times fast because its engine is insanely efficient and keeps specific data ready to be loaded the exact moment it's needed. Why did Sucker Punch go through so much trouble in developing such amazing software? I don't know. Maybe they just respect our storage space and understand that we don't want to nuke half of the games in it just to shove in one. And maybe they also know that, generally speaking, no one likes loading times. No consumer specifically asked them to go out of their way to create such an amazing engine. They definitely could have gotten away with one that wasn't so good, but they put the work in anyway, and our storage space and our time are thankful for that. And what's more is that they didn't need to sacrifice graphical quality to achieve these things, because it's still one of the most beautiful looking games to come out this entire generation. So why is Modern Warfare so insanely massive? If I were to take a guess, I'd say it's likely big assets supported by the IW engine and a metric ton of duplication of those assets, so loading times aren't an eternity and a day. But does that really excuse the absurd size of the game? How many more titles should be allowed to balloon this much before it starts to become unacceptable? Thankfully, Black Ops Cold War is already confirmed to be much smaller, both on current and next-gen consoles. But how long will it stay that way, and how much larger will the next Call of Duty be? With gaming making the move over to hyper-fast SSDs over old-school hard disk drives, games can do away with constant asset duplication to save on loading times. But we're no longer saving money on space like we used to. Right now, a 2 terabyte hard disk drive is anywhere between 30 to 60% cheaper than a 1 terabyte M.2 SSD from the same company. So what we gain in speed and technology, we sacrifice in price and available real estate. Of course, these prices will drop as SSDs become more standard, but it'll take years for them to match the cent per gigabyte rate that hard disk drives currently have. So while we may enter an era where loading times are starting to become a thing of the past, we're still likely going to end up spending more money on space than we did before. Another reason as to why huge file sizes are an issue isn't just because storage space. It's a total lack of consideration for people who have not so stellar internet connections. There are 47 million adults who live in rural areas of the United States, which are areas that have extremely limited ISP options, and those who have internet access likely have either strict data caps, mediocre download speeds, or both. And of those tens of millions, I'm willing to bet a couple of them play video games. In fact, in the blog post that announced the patch that would help shrink Destiny 2's file size, Bungie specifically acknowledged and apologized to people with capped or second-rate internet. Generally speaking, the internet service infrastructure in the United States is subpar all around, but people in rural areas are especially fucked. Over time, it'll become more and more difficult for them to be digital game owners. In some cases, it'll be difficult for them to even download an update for a game they own physically. They're doubly screwed when they want a game that's exclusively available digitally, and not only would downloading it be a potential multi-day commitment, but the game would probably hold their storage space hostage because they might be too reluctant to download it again if they uninstall. As the quality of assets grow, game sizes on average are going to follow. It's an inevitability that goes hand in hand with ever-evolving hardware and game development technology. And to make things worse, there will be some games running on very inefficient engines requiring more gluttonous hoarding of space than what should be necessary for their genre. Unfortunately, it'll take a hot minute for the price of SSDs to sink enough that an extra terabyte or two is no longer a significant expense. Worst case scenario, people who only play AAA games might only be able to fit about 5 to 8 titles on their PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X before filling them up, meaning significantly more frequent cleaning up of their space, or spending up to $200 for more of it. It's inconvenient, but unfortunately it's the growing pains of new technology. This concludes all of my thoughts on the subject of growing video game file sizes. It's a bit more ranty than the other videos I usually make, but it's something that's been bugging me for a while. Hopefully I wasn't too obnoxious about it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.